When people describe Sasquatch encounters, the paranormal label usually comes less from what's seen and more from how the experience is interpreted and described. People will say things like, it appeared suddenly, it just kind of vanished into thin air, the tracks were there, and then they just weren't. And those descriptions are often taken as evidence that Sasquatches aren't biological animals and that they had to be something supernatural or ghostly. But here's one thing that almost never gets brought up in that conversation. That exact same language was used to describe orangutans and gorillas before Western science formally accepted them. And this isn't just speculation. It's documented in many texts, but today we're going to be talking about how the book Great Ape Odyssey describes it. This is a book that traces the Western discovery, classification, and cultural interpretation of the great apes. I want to walk through that history and then draw the very important parallel to how Sasquatch encounters are described today. And my goal here today isn't to argue that Sasquatch is definitely a biological thing or to say that folks who think they have paranormal qualities are wrong. I am simply trying to show that this interpretive pattern has happened before and that it's worth considering. Also, before we totally dive in, if you're new to the channel, hi, my name's Terrestrial. I'm a naturalist, data scientist, and also the creator of the Sasquatch Data Project. I love science, math, statistics, AI, and Bigfoot, so if those things are your jam too, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. One of the central points in Great Ape Odyssey is that long before orangutans and gorillas were formally discovered and accepted by Western science, people knew something was out there. And these things weren't described as an unclassified primate, rare species. They were described as monsters, half human, wild men, or ghosts. And early Europeans didn't frame apes as wildlife. They framed them as something they couldn't explain, something that blurred the line between human, ape, and something else. And that really matters because when you have a thing that looks broadly human, behaves intelligently, and lives in an environment that people can't easily get through, people don't automatically interpret it as just another animal. They describe it in the only ways that are available to them at the time. And this is where Great Ape Odyssey becomes especially striking. The book describes how adult male orangutans move through the forest, often described as silently, deliberately, and appearing suddenly at close range. And then it describes what often happens next. An orangutan can appear, be observed, and then just seemingly vanish. The author then explains that when someone experiences this, a human-like figure appearing and then suddenly vanishing, it's easy to understand why people interpreted this as orangutans being ghosts. And the book uses very explicit language to describe this, like silently appearing, seemingly vaporizing, and then just disappearing into the forest. And that language is not metaphorical. It reflects how these encounters were genuinely perceived at the time. And very importantly, this is not unique to one author. Naturalists writing about orangutans in Borneo also describe them as just being there one moment and gone the next, noting that if alarmed, the orangutans would enter the forest and seemingly disappear. That should sound familiar. Another consistent theme in Great Ape Odyssey is how the environment shaped interpretation. A dense rainforest, heavy vegetation, swamps, poor visibility, all of these things affected the observer's descriptions. In many of these accounts, observers would lose sight of the animal quickly. They couldn't pursue the animal because of the dense vegetation, or they couldn't find any usable trackways just because of the environment itself. So when these people were saying that these apes were just disappearing, it didn't mean they just vanished into thin air. It just meant that the animal was moving in ways that humans couldn't track, and there's nothing paranormal about that. That's just biology intersecting with human limitations. Great Ape Odyssey also makes an important point about gorillas. Gorillas weren't formally described by Western science until the mid-1800s. And yet, long after Western science formally described them, gorillas were still portrayed as savage or violent or half-human, half-beast creatures. Explorers like Paul du Chaillu wrote about gorilla encounters using language that sounded more like folklore than zoology, describing them as apparitions or hellish dream creatures or beings that seemed almost human. And these descriptions didn't disappear when gorillas were officially classified. They were actually reinforced by museum displays, adventure literature, and later pop culture. The takeaway here is simple, but very important. Even after scientific recognition, the ghost and monster framing persisted. So what am I getting at here, and what does this all tell us? It doesn't tell us that Sasquatches are definitely great apes. It doesn't tell us that Sasquatches are definitely biological and not something paranormal. It also doesn't tell us that witnesses are interpreting everything perfectly. But what it does tell us is this: When humans encounter something that is human-like, rare, poorly documented, and difficult to follow, they tend to describe it using the language that they're familiar with and have. And historically, that language often includes ghost-like qualities or paranormal aspects. This doesn't mean that the experience wasn't real, but it also does not mean that the experience was actually paranormal. Before orangutans were understood, they were ghosts. Before gorillas were accepted, they were monsters. Before apes were biology, they were something harder to explain. So when people today describe Sasquatch encounters with similar terms like vanishing, leaving no trace, just disappearing, we shouldn't just shut down the conversation. It should remind us that this is what the unknown has always sounded like. At least, right up until better evidence changed the story. But that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you want to keep up with more things Sasquatch data, and you're interested in learning how to bring more science, data, and statistics into the Sasquatch topic, make sure you follow me on pretty much any social media. My handle is at Sasquatch Data on pretty much everything. But thank you so much again for watching. Stay rad, stay curious, and stay kind.